Welcome to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered with Perry Clark. This program looks at mental health from unique perspectives and shows you how to manage your life by finding the knots that help you and stay away from the ones that could be a disadvantage. Now, here is your host, Perry Clark.
Hello all, welcome back to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with you for another one of our episodes. And I want to remind you, as always, that this podcast is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute working with a licensed mental health professional. Please find one in your area to work on your unique issues. So today's guests, we're both on the same, what we call listserv or exchange list that allows us to get help from other therapists or find other referrals for people. And recently, this individual started a post that I then followed over onto Instagram and was watching several of their videos about a new program they've started called Living Your Awkward Self. And it is very much focused towards BIPOC and LGBT individuals who are especially first generation. And so at that point, after watching a few of the videos, I figured, let's get him on the podcast. So I'd like to introduce you to Jose Aleman. Is a therapist turned coach with a passion for helping individuals thrive. With over 20 years of experience counseling adults and couples, he has transitioned from traditional therapy into coaching, blending his expertise in mental health with a fresh approach to personal growth. Currently, Jose enjoys a thriving practice in San Francisco and Oakland, while also embarking on exciting new ventures into social media. He is the creator of Loving Your Awkward Self, an empowering online platform offering uplifting, confidence-boosting content aimed at queer, first-generation BIPOC individuals. While all are welcome, Jose curates content specifically designed to reflect the unique experiences of these communities. Passionate about helping people embrace their authentic selves, Jose is committed to creating safe space where everyone can grow and thrive. So welcome to Untying Knots, Jose.
Thank you for having me, Perry.
Thank you for being here and being willing to talk more about living your awkward self. But before we get there, I'm kind of always curious. The question I ask to everybody is sort of, how did you get here?
I would say that my journey has been towards mental health or becoming a therapist, and now currently trying my hat at a coach and social media. Started from being a very observant kid. I think from my youth, I was just very observant of how adults acted, why adults did the things they did. And I just remember very much constantly always asking myself, why do adults behave the way they behave? And so I think I've always had a very curious mind since I was young. I think I'm the second. I'm the youngest of two. And that always kind of gave me a perspective to step back and observe, why is my brother getting in trouble? Why is he getting yelled at in that way? And so I just learned through observation that I can improve certain of my own outcomes by being really observant. I think that led me to then having a lot of people kind of really be comfortable with me and coming to me and talking to me because I became such a good observer and listener and kind of being able to kind of take a step back. In recognizing that, I was like, I like talking to people and they like talking to me. And so then I became a counselor, recognized I was good at it. Then I became a therapist. Then my dream was to be a private practice therapist. And I achieved that in 2017 when I went full time. And so now I've been doing that for about 7 years. And for the longest time, I had this dream of doing more, than therapy. And instead of just being the observer or talking to people one-on-one, kind of wanting to do a bit more exposure, a bit more presence. And that's kind of what's led me to now doing social media and these videos and trying my hat at offering information via the social media landscape and arriving here.
Gotcha. So before we go into the living awkwardly, I'm kind of curious because I know there's also the standpoint, especially as our field being predominantly a field that is often filled with a lot of women. How is it for you to feel coming to this field as a man, and especially as a man of Latinx, I'm not sure which designation you want to particularly use, coming into this field, which is usually not seen as a field that we should be that we would normally work in?
I I think it's so beneficial when there's any exposure to men of color, right? Like any queer people of color that are in mental health, that are coaches, social workers, therapists,
Mm-hmm.
because it does have this kind of tint towards, feminine energy, female energy, and a lot of women, people who identify as women or females are seen as caregivers, are seen as the ones that kind of um, are the helpers in society. But really,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of us that can also just be, or have had lots of lived experience as helpers, as caregivers, as caretakers. And I just view it as really important for me to, uh, and we'll get more into this, but to be seen is one of my
Mm-hmm.
main kind of things that I've wanted for my life, to be seen, because I have felt invisible for so often and for so long. And so this whole thing is just a challenge for me because I want to be seen, even though I'm kind of scared to be seen. But the whole intent is to be seen. And so,
Mm-hmm.
as a man of color, as a Latinx, as a gay man of color, I find it very empowering to be able to um, show and demonstrate vulnerability, um, emotional vulnerability, emotional kindness, sadness, crying, like just kind of the whole full range of human experience. And so
Mm-hmm.
to be a member of that community, mental health, and as a man, as a person of color, as a dark-skinned person, I think is really important.
Very nice, which I think leads very nicely into talking about your loving your awkward self.
Yes. So this whole idea around loving your awkward self stems from the very much fact that being it's an interesting denouement, right? Consider myself an immigrant. I mean, consider
Mm-hmm.
myself an immigrant even though I was 2 years old when I came here, just because of the very nature of I had 2 years in a different country and a different culture, and I got ripped away from that. And so that ripping away to me still constitutes an immigration and a
Mm-hmm.
change versus if I was even born here, even if I was only 2 years in Nicaragua, which is the country that I was born in. So being an immigrant, being a gay man, being a person of color, all of these differences allow being poor, right? Having trauma and difficulties growing up in an immigrant family that's stricken with poverty and challenges. There's a lot of hiding. There's a lot of survival skills. There's a lot of coping and adapting, and wanting to join and wanting to be a part of sometimes makes you then distort your authenticity and showcase certain aspects and hide things that you consider to be um, deficiencies in connection.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, all of those deficiencies are strengths, right? All those things that we find awkward and unpleasant and unruly and unwelcomed, and all these fears that we have about like, people won't accept that, like, people won't like that. That's not even real. Like
Mm-hmm.
to own those things, to really embrace our awkwardness, to really embrace who we are and all our messy glory is a very empowering and powerful thing. And you will
Mm-hmm.
find your people when you allow yourself to be seen in the daylight and no longer hide and distort. And so this whole idea is around emphasizing and encouraging people to be who you are and no longer hide.
Very nice. So, can you tell people more as they start looking at this stuff you've done on social media? What are some of the focus points that you have talked about in your various reels?
I think some of the focus points that I'm actually kind of coming to terms with, so this is still very new. And I'm very much in the openness for it to become what it's going to become, right? Like I'm still not quite sure exactly what it's going to become, but starting it off with loving your awkward self, this whole idea of letting yourself be awkward. But I'm noticing also like I'm an avoidant person in my baseline, like in terms of attachment style. I tend to withdraw, I tend to shut down, I get to be a little bit avoidant out of fear of emotionality. And so I think my reels are speaking to people like me in the sense that people that hid or people that got scared of life or people that got scared of being themselves and avoided or have fears of being their authentic self for fear of losing relationships or fear of losing something. And so the whole idea, I would say, my reels currently are to, one, speak to other avoidant folk, normalizing the reasons why we became kind of shut down and avoidant, and also recognizing the limitations of that survival strategy and things and ways that you can begin to lean back into life and lean back into risking being seen and risking being hurt as well, right? Like we can tolerate more than what we could have back then. And so updating our files to who we really are now, not how we were and what we experienced back then.
Which you mentioned the survival strategy. I'm not sure that a lot of people would understand that terminology. So could you speak a bit more to that? Because I'm sure that's a mind-blowing thought. I mean, to you and I in this field, we think of it as very common, but for many people, I'm sure they don't even think about that concept of survival strategies.
So to me, or not just to me, but from what I've learned and what I've experienced, survival strategies are around rules, right? Like rules that we kind of enacted or made up or were taught to us by our caregivers and our generations before us on best ways to, one, survive, right? That's the main aspect of it. And so this idea between survive and thrive is really important in that context. To understand survival strategies is to understand that they're not around thriving, right? It's not about creating, growing. It's around maintaining, being, lasting. And I just think that, again, due to poverty, due to abuse, due to adverse experiences, you're not always able to focus on growth. And sometimes you're just focused on making it through the day. And so that's a lot around like, what are my basic needs? What are the things that I just have to get to? I have to eat. I have to work for the money. I have to sleep. The have tos, the extras of thriving. Like, what do I want to become in my life? What do I want to experience in my life? Like these add-ons that are very nice when you get to experience them are a luxury and a privilege to us, to the folks that are still in survival mode. And so in life, you either are born in survival mode or you grow up in survival mode, but there's also an important piece where you might arrive at some point in your life, in your adulthood, where you're no longer in survival mode. You actually did a thing, or your family has done the thing that you're now at a higher positioning. Unfortunately, our neuroceptors and our brain doesn't always update our files. And so we function as if we're still in that survival mode. And we function from the same rules and the same strategies as if we're still experiencing that same level of limitation and lack of resources and scarcity. And so this whole idea is to, right, one, recognize the survival strategies and the limitations and the scarcity and the behaviors that all go with it make sense. And there's a reason for why you behave the way you behave. And two, perhaps though, it's important to kind of be mindful of the moment, of your current moment and your current reality. And are those things still needed and in place? And can we update some files to recognize like, oh shit, I don't need to necessarily survive anymore. I can actually thrive now.
Well, and a flip of that is that in some ways the notion that, oh, you're getting angry at your boss or coworker, and it turns out just the way they're either memorizing the pattern of their speech or just some other intrinsic element is taking you back to what you experienced as a kid.
Correct.
And that, for what you're saying, that survival strategy is kicking back online now around this and trying to help you survive in it, which at that time, because of the power differential, you might have bowed out, been more quiet when this is a moment with whatever the situation is, maybe that you do need to be much more present, much more advocating for yourself. Not to say that it's fighting, but advocating is not fighting.
Correct. You can be assertive. You can be more present. But you're right. A tone can kick back into survival strategy like, oh, I need to be quiet right now. And so I think that's what I meant in terms of like survival strategies having rules in around them, right? Like when I face this, when I experience this, then this is the rule that I enact, which is either, oh, this is a moment where I cannot talk, or this is a moment where I cannot speak, or this is a moment where I need to be silent. I need to be that wallpaper. I need a backup. And maybe not, right? As you pointed out in your example, maybe that's not a moment to back up anymore. Maybe that's not a moment to be silent anymore. Just because you receive that tone, we can slow down our reaction and remind ourselves like, oh, it makes sense that I want to back up. And I understand why I want to back up. And I'm not facing perhaps my father right now in this instance. I'm not facing my grandfather, my uncle, whoever it was that this current tone reminds you of. I'm facing this boss, and I am my age, and it's this year, and I can right now withstand this moment and be more present.
Mm-hmm. Now, one could also say these things are not unique to everybody, but how do you flavor it more to fit both the queer and also the BIPOC experiences?
I would say that in particular to those identities, we live in America, right? And so as a person of color, the majority of this nation is white. As a queer gay man, the majority of this nation is straight, heterosexual. Mm-hmm. And as an immigrant, as someone who comes to this country from a different country, the majority of people are born here. Mm-hmm. They're not immigrating necessarily from a different country. So you're constantly faced with not being in the majority, and you're constantly faced with just this otherness. And so I want folks to understand that there's a real impact to multiple otherness as you grow up and as you experience life. And it makes sense. Again, a lot of what I preach, I would say, is one, it makes sense. A lot of your behaviors, a lot of your makeup, a lot of who you are currently makes sense given what you experience. It's important to understand so that we build compassion, because understanding makes me understand why I'm reacting the way I am. It gives me compassion. So instead of hating on myself, I'm like, sure, that makes sense. And then I can enact the changes that I want. Mm-hmm. So, when you're gay and you're growing up, all other adolescents that are heterosexual are able to very easily, maybe not very easily, but they are encouraged to talk about their crushes. They're encouraged to have crushes, and they share that with each other, and they commune with each other, these teenagers. But when you're gay, at least when I was growing up, and I don't think it's actually that quite different, and maybe in certain sections of the country, you don't do that. There's a lot of fear, right? There's a fear. If I look at a guy that I was attracted to, I'd be like, oh shit, someone's gonna see me. So I avert my eyes. There's a constant aversion to don't look at what you want to look at. Don't go after what you want to go after, right? Don't like what you want to like or what you innately like, because it might bring you harm. This whole idea that my actual wants can bring me harm shuts down my connection to my wants. And so there's a way in which I, again, distort, adapt, and hide. I can understand all that and have sympathy and empathy for myself and my young self. And then I can also just remind myself, I'm no longer in that position where I was young and I had to survive and make sure that I wasn't beat up, I wasn't ridiculed or bullied. But now in my adulthood, I don't have to be that scared. And so if I encounter someone where I'm now going to allow my eyes to check out who I want them to check out, I will allow myself to say oh, that guy's cute. And if someone comes at me, it's like, oh, you're gay or some negativity, there's a fine line here where I want to make sure that, right, I'm not going to try to just there's still real harm. Mm-hmm. There's still real, I want to be real here that there's still real harm for queer folk in being themselves, in no matter how old you are, because we live in such a homophobic society. And there is still a lot of opportunity to be much more authentic and real in this world as we get stronger and older and more autonomous and more independent. So that's how I kind of gear it towards specifically certain aspects of my identity.
Lovely. So let me push that a little further and ask this question, especially for us as our queer and BIPOC in our existence in communities. How is it also for those of us who have now either who lived through the age crisis or have been born afterwards and now filling the gaps that were left by those lost?
That's a really great framework in that question, right? Because there was a gap. There is a filling of the gap because there was a huge generation that was lost because of the AIDS epidemic. And there's also a huge amount of history that was lost because it wasn't captured and it wasn't valued. So much of our ability to lean on our elders, our ancestors as queer folk has been lost to us. And so there's been a lot of needing to refine and or allow ourselves. I mean, there are gay folks older than me, obviously, and queer folks older than me, which I really appreciate. And, you know, take on the mantle of elders,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like take on the mantles of um, having the knowledge as we move towards through this world. So I would say one, recognize the grief of that loss, the realness of that loss, and the generational aspects of that loss, right? Because the younger generation doesn't have the trauma of the AIDS epidemic um, as much as I and people older than me do. And it's just the usage of the word queer, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
queer for older folks is very hard because queer was so derogatory and negative. And I would say around my age group and younger, there's been a retaking of that. And so there's a distinction to be had around the different generations and how they talk about that word, how they talk about embracing your power or moving into your authenticity. Perhaps the younger ones are much more easier to do that with, or they find it younger for them, easier for themselves compared to the older generation. But did
So
I speak to what you were speaking to?
I think so. I think it also gets into one of the other flip things we're hitting is seeing is, of course, younger generations who don't have, as we know, history to understand the context of things of what older generations have gone through and surviving. And there is, again, one of those things of where did these survival strategies versus thriving strategies come into play for older generation, and especially older queer BIPOC individuals too.
Exactly. There's the difference, most likely in the way that they move or in the way that they walk the world, you know. And if we can have conversations between older and younger generations, like there's so much knowledge that the older can instill in the younger, but there's so much, I don't know, probably experience and knowledge that the younger can instill on the older, right? Like there's a way in which
Mm-hmm.
we can all like, if we can make space for our differences and come together and just share and talk and I don't know, like a group circle or like, I don't know, one of those meeting or encounterings, it can be very worthwhile.
Very nice. So where it's probably a little self-explanatory, but where'd the awkward portion of this come from?
The awkward portion comes from just the fact that I felt so awkward. You know, like, I felt so awkward myself in my life. I just felt different from people. Like I didn't get the same humor. I didn't get, and there might be, yeah, I didn't get the same jokes. I was called gullible very often in my life because I would take things very concretely or like, oh, like at face value. And so I just felt super different. And I just felt like, man, I am not getting the same social cues. I'm not capturing things the same way as other people. And I would judge the crap out of myself off of that. And I would try, like, oh, try harder, like to read the cue, try harder to know the latest pop culture, to know the references, to know the things. But it was just pushing me to try harder to be not me. You know, it was just pushing me
Mm-hmm.
harder to be someone I wasn't. And so this whole idea of like, all right, I don't know the pop culture. All right, I don't know the artist name. I don't know that music. I don't know what you're talking about. And just allowing myself to just not know and allowing myself to be the awkward one of like, oh, you don't get that, or you never tasted that, or you never did that. And at this point, I'm like, no, I did it. Tell me about it. You know, like, no, I haven't
Mm-hmm.
really faced that, or I never really lived that, or I never really had that. Tell me about that. But it's no longer a ding on my beingness. You know, it's just I'm not a part of. I am not a part of that, and I am okay with that otherness now. I'm okay with being the other. I'm okay with being the awkward one out and standing
Mm-hmm.
out in that way. So I want others to also allow themselves to not be a part of and to be othered and love it and to embrace it.
Very nice. I think one of the other questions there is what do you think is the obstacle for people actually acknowledging and admitting that awkwardness?
Can you repeat that?
I'm kind of wondering what you think are some of the things that keep people from recognizing that awkwardness and that they can be more than that awkwardness.
I think social engagement. I think people want to, again, join a lot. And I think part of what keeps people from owning or naming that awkwardness is that they fear that it's going to be a cause of disengagement or disconnection and that they will lose people or people won't accept them or see them or want to be around them. And so I think one of my main hypothesis is that they fear that it will lead to isolation and aloneness. And something that they most likely have felt a long, long time, and they no longer want to feel alone and isolated. And so I think there's a mistake made by thinking that if I present myself a certain way, if I am a certain way, I will then find my people. I will no longer be alone. But I think the paradox is actually more true. To be more you in all your awkwardness, to be more different, is to then find your people and to not be alone.
So I think that's a beautiful place for us to go and take our break here. And we'll continue our discussion afterwards from here. So I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with Jose Aleman. And do you want to go with your therapist credentials or your coach credentials?
Let's go with the coach, just because it's not therapy and not providing therapy. So coach, yes.
Okay, coach credentials here on Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. So stay tuned, folks. We'll be back shortly.
Enjoying our shows and can't get enough of us? Follow us on Instagram at Voice America Talk Radio and see what we're cooking up for you.
Our lives and the world around us can get messy and frustrating. Untangle and Grow Counseling's focus is to untangle that mess and make sense of it so you have a good foundation to build and grow from. Visit us on the web at untangleandgrowcounseling.com. Perry Clark offers individual psychotherapy, couples and family therapy, and adolescence therapy from a variety of coping materials and resources. Visit untangleandgrowcounseling.com for more information.
We're with you wherever Alexa and Google are. At home, in the car, on your smart TV, and your connected devices.
Hey, Alexa.
Hey, Google. Play my favorite Voice America podcast on TuneIn.
It's just that easy. But make sure you actually mention the name of the podcast show to make it work.
Follow us on Twitter for more great ideas at Voice America Empowerment.
You are listening to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. If you have a question or comment about our podcast, send an email to pclark@untyingknotspodcast.com. That's pclark@untyingknotspodcast.com. And now, back to the program.
Hello all, welcome back to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with Jose Aleman, who is a coach and former therapist. So if you listen to our first half, we were talking about the loving your awkward self, which is focused very much towards BIPOC and queer, as well as in first generation into immigrants. But one of the big issues that also comes into, and I know that we talk about whether it's a coach, whether it's a therapist, talk about the issues with that aspect of survival strategies is also boundaries.
Mm-hmm. So
what would you like people to know when talking about and thinking about this subject, as well as feeling?
One of the things that I've kind of really wanted people to understand around boundary setting is, and I think there's a lot of content creators out there that are saying the same thing around, to state a boundary is one thing and to enforce a boundary is another thing. But the combination of the first step is to be aware of your boundary, then communicate your boundary, and then enforce your boundary. That three prongs, that makes sense. But where I want to kind of expand the understanding is that there are also different levels of boundary setting. And I just feel like people are either sometimes black and white. They either have very poor to no boundaries, or they have really strict, rigid, harsh boundaries. Mm-hmm. And it's either like, don't talk to me, or that's not okay. Very harsh, very clear, and or none. But I want people to play with the spectrum. There is a light way to set boundaries. There's a medium way to set boundaries, and a harsh way or hard way. And the way I kind of think about it, and I have this kind of freebie on my website that people can find, a light way is A light boundary is when you first get to know someone, people will cross your boundaries, they don't know you, they don't know what your boundaries are. So it's a really great opportunity to lightly just tell someone like, hey, you don't know me, you don't know this, but I want to let you know I want X, Y, or Z, right? The prioritization there is the relationship. You don't know, I mean, I care about you, the boundary is important, but the relationship is most important. So it's a light setting. If it continues to get crossed after setting it, then there's a medium, right? Like, hey, I've told you this before, and you're still not doing it. I need to re-emphasize, this is important to me. At that point, there's a medium, there's a balance between the relationship and the boundary itself. You're balancing both, and both matter. If it continues to get crossed, though, or it's a super important boundary, then I understand that there is a space for a hard boundary where the relationship no longer is priority. The boundary is priority. In order for this relationship to continue, I need you to respect this boundary. And if you don't, your enforcement of what will happen if it continues to get crossed is much stronger. And so I just want folks to know that there's a light way to do it, a medium way to do it, and a hard way to do it.
Well, and I think the additional thing to add to that, which is also something that has probably been talked about in other social media, is the aspect that the boundary is yours. It's about taking care of you, not so much them or any of the other people outside the boundary. So if the boundary's been so easily crossed, what is that aspect of how's that taking care of you? Is it the medium? How is it taking care of you versus the place where you get to the hard, where it is so egregious? As you said, the relationship is not important. It's at protecting yourself is that important. And there's ways that I know that gets used, that in its own way gets used as a weapon against people as well.
Boundary setting?
Misuse of the idea of what a boundary is.
Yes, it can be weaponized.
Right. And understanding that difference, that the boundary is first and foremost about taking care of yourself in context of this relationship, is an important distinction, because again, there's plenty of people who go down to that hard boundary and make even before the relationship has been established.
Exactly. And even before they're giving a person a chance to course correct. All right. Or even before they're giving a chance for the person to be aware that something occurred. I didn't know very much people are like, the boundaries for you, the boundaries about you. I'm somewhat in that camp, but I'm also very much in the camp that it's relational, right? Because people are like, people sometimes say, make it about you and what you need, and not necessarily like if I say, hey, don't do this, please. I know a lot of people have said like, that's not a boundary, that's a request. And I get that. But that request is like, hey, I don't want to be named this. Can you please come name me this? I don't want to be called Joseph. My name is Jose. Even if I request you to like say, like, call me Jose, please don't call me Joseph. I'm letting you know there's a boundary here. I am requesting this of you, but there is a boundary here. And so I just want to make sure that people understand, like, you can make requests of people and let them know where your boundaries are. But the most important thing is your enforcement of your boundary. Like, that is yours, right? Like your ability to let people and remind them gently, again, lightly at first, like, hey, not Joseph, Jose, friendly, light, doesn't matter. Again, if it happens again, my enforcement is mine. I'm very serious. Jose is a name, not Joseph. To the point where, like, dude, you're not listening to me. This is the last time I'm going to let you know, right? Like, it's Jose, not Joseph. If you don't do it again, we're done. So.
Which, as to very much the point, the boundary is in connection to a relationship. It's not sitting in isolation.
Yes, exactly.
And I think there again becomes a standpoint of how it gets weaponized is it's used as an isolation technique as opposed to a relational technique.
I see what you mean. Very much so. Correct.
Which also then comes back to these standpoints of, are you in a survival technique versus a thriving technique?
Yes. If you are in yes. You know, different schools of thought have different ways of also calling that, right? Like if you're in your window of tolerance, you're in a thriving space, and so you can be more relationally oriented. If you're like either hyper aroused or hypo aroused or outside your window of tolerance, we're in survival mode, and most likely we will not hold in mind the relationship aspect, and it would just be all reaction and protection.
which I think that distinction, which I don't think a lot of people are thinking of that distinction. And especially depending on what experiences they've had growing up, they might not even have a concept of these distinctions we're talking about.
Right. They might not even be around people that have shown them that there are people that can listen to you, that can respect your boundaries, that can receive you. And they may be around a lot of folks or have had a lot of experiences where they're constantly met with people that show indifference to what they need or their own boundary. And so all they know is you either care for me or you don't care for me. Either I don't need to assert myself or I hella need to assert myself. Whereas there's a whole gamut of folk where you don't need to function from such extremes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And especially when we look at the context of what it means to be queer, BIPOC, and immigrant.
Mm-hmm.
Especially, I mean, I could imagine from the immigrant standpoint, where does it hit against tradition? What is the concept of tradition?
Mm-hmm. Or even family, right? Like, especially as an immigrant family, there's a lot of scarcity coming from a different country to a new country, and your family very much can sometimes tell you, "Hey, be careful," right? Like, don't tell people, and it's real. People, I didn't grow up this way, but people that grew up in an undocumented status, their families very much are telling them, like, be careful what you say, be careful who you trust, be careful who you bring home, because it can really harm the situation. But even if you weren't undocumented, just the very nature of the family can still this sense of like, you can trust the family, but you can't trust others outside the family. And so what happens if you need to assert boundaries inside the family? What happens if you don't agree with people inside the family? Like you're going against that norm.
Which then comes also the same flip so that we hit in issues of BIPOC communities, trust in the community versus outside the community, trust in, and for queer as well.
Exactly. And so it's a lot of learning to unlearn,
Yeah. But also that just because of each of these identities exist, and you can have all three of them as you do, doesn't mean that these issues are in just one identity in one community. They're in all of them. As I was talking to a client this last week where we were sort of talking about the aspect of queer relationship, person left home when they were 19, married a 30-year-old. And as I listened to it, it's like, oh, did the escape from the family because it was a path of escape, but turns out they found themselves in the exact same situation again. And it's like, yeah, we're not immune to that concept. It happens in the straight world. It happens in the queer world as well.
Most definitely. Right. And that's a very good function of survival strategy, where like we don't see the forest for the trees. That person saw an exit, saw a path of abundance potentially, but wasn't seeing certain red flags, or wasn't seeing the whole picture. But just because perhaps they were just trying to flee or run from something. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. But the notion that just because we're queer that we don't have to deal with that is like, nope.
No, there's a lot of overlap. Like in all these communities and identities, humans are humans. We're all humans, There's a lot of overlap.
Yeah, which suddenly makes me think of that line from Tu Wong Fu. There are human rules that we live by and maneuver by.
Yeah. Fact.
That's good. So for our next part, why don't we go ahead and get into one of the classic confusions that happens? And since you have sort of moved from one to the other, I know there's always a big issue between the idea of what's the difference between a therapist and a coach.
Yes. And to be quite clear and frank, I'm not quite sure. I don't quite know exactly the difference in the sense of like, I know people have stated that therapists treat mental health disorders and therapists do treatment plans and they diagnose and they treat disorders, and coaches don't do that. but that doesn't really fly, right? Like there's plenty of therapists that don't necessarily do treatment plans or treat only mental health diagnoses from the DSM-5. So I think there's a lot of overlap. I think therapists can do coaching work, right? So just my understanding is coaching can be very growth oriented. They're very much into not just solutions and problem solving, but also like promoting abundance, promoting growth, promoting accountability, next steps. What can you do? And there might be this idea that coaches spend less time on processing traumas or looking at the past or looking at the injuries that may have accrued in our lived experiences and how are they showing up now. Again, though, I'm never taking a coaching course. I am not certified as a coach. So I'm very careful I don't know enough about the coaching world to really limit them to or understand where they're coming from. That's just my idea. But I do know the therapy world very well. And in the therapy world, there is a full gamut in which I think there is that traditional element of therapy where you're treating mental health disorders from the DSM-5 and you are diagnosing and whatnot. But there's also the gamut of therapy where you can be very much a life coach. You can very much well be promoting someone's future path and abundance and growth. And I think everything that perhaps a coach does. And so I think a therapist can very well function underneath therapist and coach label. I don't know if a coach can do what a therapist can do. But again, I want to be very clear, that's a bias. I don't know enough. So I'll just put that out there.
Yeah, because I know I've always heard that coaches are about the future, therapists are about the past. And yet in reality, yeah, we'll look at the past because we want to figure out where the patterns are that are disrupting the future.
Correct. And the present, yes.
Exactly. And that notion also, I mean, obviously some would say the cost factor as well, but not everything that you're going forward is going to be successful if you don't also resolve what disrupts you in the past.
Exactly. And I guess the only other thing is that there's a lot of learning about the nervous system and psychology when you become a therapist, right? Like, I think the coaching world might be getting a bit more disciplined in what they teach and whatnot, but it's not supervised, right? There's no board, there's no one watching over that profession, so it can be very, all wild west a little bit out there too.
Right. Well, and I had someone else say that to me as well, and I had to remind them, I think you're forgetting about the wild west. It was very easy to get shot in the back. Which, I mean, I know that's a naysaying, but it's like, that's one of the other qualities about when we gloss over the history of and use the term wild west.
But you can be shot in the back, meaning like unsafe or?
Unsafe, or that again, that where you're trusted, it's very easy for someone to shoot you in the back.
Oh yeah, exactly. Because you don't quite know how this person is going to hold you or use that information. But yes, it can be very well. And again, I want to be clear about my bias. There's plenty of therapists out there that can also shoot you in the back. There are plenty of people in both professions that can be very helpful and also very damaging. So,
right. I think the biggest difference is that there is at least a structure to address when therapists have been bad.
Yes, there is a recourse of action that you can take. There's a disciplinary board. You can do something. You cannot do that with the coach. So, pros and cons.
So there's a question of where does that element of safety to ensure that you're not getting shot in the back comes into play. And equally, we're seeing the same thing too, what we're seeing in our profession with the movements towards things like AI, as well as some of what we might describe as the gig-based big core therapy companies.
Exactly. And the move toward online mental health and the affordability of it, like the way they advertise it and all the pros of it is very compelling. But there is like a con or like a concern, if I may, around that practice,
And that can also influence, again, whether someone's using a coach or a therapist.
Mm-hmm. If I may, the way I kind of think about it, that's kind of concerning is just that I want to acknowledge that the internship phase of becoming a therapist is an effed up phase, right? Like there's a lot of ways in which organizations, nonprofits, even private practice supervisors take advantage of folks that are trying to gain hours to become this profession. And you have a lot less power as an intern. And there's a lot of ways in which you've been underpaid to do some severely complicated work. And so the paradigm is shifting in the sense of like with social media and technology and better health and Lyra and all these other facets, where I can understand the interns choosing these online platforms and choosing perhaps this potential to be a bit more free in their pursuit of hours and their pursuit of payments. But it doesn't really serve the industry or to serve the profession or serve the clients at all times. But I can understand why people are trying to find innovative ways to get into the profession. It can be really hard and taxing.
Right. Well, it's also the advantage, especially with what you're doing with your program, is the fact that we can actually talk about these things, and it's not hidden as a factor about what people choose to go into this field, which is another other reason why, as BIPOC people coming into this field, what are some of the obstacles we're going to be facing, as well as choosing to go into business for yourself or private practice for yourself versus working for some.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think there's a lot of virtue to there's a lot of risk to working for yourself, but working under an organization or working under certain folks, it can be very taxing, very difficult, especially when you have different values and you have different visions of what it can look like,
Which is, I'd say, is a safe bet of why we're in private practice, as opposed to continuing working for one of these companies or an agency.
There's a lot more freedom to engage in and bring in things that traditionally have been told to us that you cannot do. That's being way too present. You need to be, like, I know that we're moving away a little bit from that whole like neutral whiteboard kind of therapist where you just kind of let the client free associate this Freudian kind of way. But there's still a lot of people that function from that very like neutral, I want to insert myself kind of non-relational way. And I just think that, I don't know, as community-oriented, BIPOC, queer people, like that just doesn't work, like our folks don't want some neutral non-participant just listening to them,
Which I think also brings us up to that, my classic question of what do you think is a myth and reality around mental health? And especially from the lens of what you've been doing with your project.
I think, especially for Latinx community still, like, you want to go to therapy when you're really crazy, right? Like this whole idea that you still go to therapy when you're crazy, or you still go to therapy when there's something really wrong. And couples also like go to therapy when they're like almost over, and they wait until the last minute. And so this, one of the biggest myths that I would like folks to walk away with is, don't go until you're almost like on the floor, right? Like, to go to therapy earlier on isn't a sign of weakness, isn't a sign of your incapabilities of managing life. It's a sign of strength to know assistance or support is needed, right? It's a sign of maturity to be able to say, like, you know what, I need something here. And so a myth is it's weakness to go to therapy, it's craziness to go. And so the reality is it's strength, it's courageous, it's maturity to understand when you need mental health support or emotional mental health support.
Yeah, because I think there's that messaging that goes in, like you said, about that you have to go when it's absolutely worth. And how many times have we heard is go to the doctor before you have the heart attack, before you have the stroke?
Before you get the diabetes, take care of your sugar levels, right? Like get the information that you need, right? Like, and so whether you tend to people's social media pages around mental health, emotional health, these relationship coaches, therapists, podcasts, even reading listening is a way in which you're already engaging with yourself in a different kind of way. So that is the value of sometimes this expansion away from traditional therapy, of having to be in the office or online. Yes, there's value in that, but there's also information outside of that traditional method that if you can allow yourself to investigate and read and listen, it can still benefit.
Well, and I think too, to what you're saying there, is that the idea that so much of that traditional was also tied up into the idea that you have to diagnose an illness.
Yes.
And there are many things that, again, happen before you get the full illness. Can you address them so that you never get the full illness?
Yes. And it's like a catch-22 because, if you're using insurance needs a diagnosis. If you need a diagnosis, then you need to give one to your client, like when they may not even, need one or qualify for one. And so are we working for our client or are we working for capitalism and insurance?
The insurance company.
The insurance company.
Yeah.
So.
Which also, again, comes back to our earlier question about our conversation about therapist, coach, who are we working for? What does it mean for us to go into businesses and even business for yourself? Because we're still here to help people. Just what are the latitudes you get?
And you get to give yourself that latitude. You get to create your own practice, right? Because I remember when I went to private practice, I was like, what kind of therapist am I going to be? What kind of therapy am I going to provide people? And then I was like, they're going to get Jose's therapy. They're going to get Jose as a therapist. And that was good enough. And I was like, oh, that's right. It's going to be through my energy, through my lens, through my eyes, just like everyone else offers. And I can too, give yourself that power and take that power, take that freedom and latitude.
Yeah. How often is so we say cookie cutter, standard model, one size fits all, still leaving you behind?
Exactly.
And there's part of why it's important for loving your awkward self.
Yes, because you add on to the tapestry, right? Like you make it more colorful away from that one size fits all, and you paint a corner that a gang of people are dying for that corner to be painted. So please love your awkward self. Please put yourself out there. People are waiting, wanting.
So where can folks find out more about you? Want to catch up some of the IG reels? Just if they want to get in touch and work with you.
So the Instagram is Coaching with Jose, called Loving Your Awkward Self. I can also be reached at, I'm so used to saying my therapist email that I'm like, wait, what's the other one? It is Jose@coachingwithjose.com. And so if you want to email me, please feel free at Jose@coachingwithjose.com. There's also www.coachingwithjose.com where you can find my website. And you can sign up for a newsletter if you would like to know when a new video drops or when you want to hear more about me.
Okay, perfect. So we'll try to have some more of those notes in the show notes. I want to thank you again for being on the show and continue to keep that loving awkward self going out there. We need it.
Thank you so much, Perry. It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed my time with you.
All righty. So stay tuned, folks. We'll be back for more with the podcast and just have a good rest of the season and holiday, because I know it's now fall, and make sure you vote.
Yes.
Thank you for tuning in for Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. Be sure to join your host, Perry Clark, for another episode on the podcast coming soon on the Voice America Empowerment Channel.